So what are institutions like IBM, not just IBM, doing uh, to uplift the skill level and or the education level,
Yeah.
or anything in AI related to young people? Is that a
hmm
topic that you see come up in your engagements or discussions at all?
There's a couple areas that has come up in terms of diversity. I think that's a really important one. I think it's generally, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, I'm speaking on behalf of myself right now too, but I think or I like to think maybe it's my own biases that I'm reflecting upon, but I think we are understanding more as a society. It's not about inclusion of diversities right now. It's not just about getting that minority into the workplace. If they're not educated in the right way, they're not going to be
Exactly.
impactful. They're going to be looked down upon, etc. Right? Because they're not at the level that the rest of the group is at. Right? We need to start earlier on, primary school, etc., to make sure that all of those groups are exposed, like to the diversity of what's available. But I do think that companies are becoming more and more aware of that. So investing more in the schools, doing more outreach programs in schools and things like that to try to bring them up. I think all of that helps to provide guidance, because the number of one-on-one conversations I can have is just limited. But if I make a tool that creates the guidance to say, hey, are you ever going to use this in production or ever going to use this in a product? And then someone answers that and it guides them, then that goes 1,000-fold versus a conversation that needs to be had.
In Youth We Trust sits down with successful entrepreneurs, business leaders, educators, and others from around the world. We spotlight how individuals and organizations are shaping a better world, directly or indirectly, for the coming generations through their focus on sustainability, equity, education, and more to empower young people to create the future they deserve. And now, in Youth We Trust.
Steven, where were you growing up, and was there a challenge that you saw, or a set of challenges that you saw around you that you wanted to solve, and that, in Lumi speak, would be a quest you may have wanted to go on?
Yeah, well, I think there was a awareness, and I think there still is similar problems right now. And because my kids pick up on some of the same things that I picked up on when I was younger, is like, it seems such an obvious statement around like war and what we see and why is there war? Why do you want to kill people? Why do you want to have these issues? As you get older, you start to understand. I remember a very good friend of mine who's a Palestinian fella, and he spoke to me and he said, this was probably like, I was probably 16 at the time. I'm 43 now. One of my best friend's fathers. And he said to me, Stephen, like, it's very difficult for someone in your situation or most situations to understand. Like my family, we had a hotel, we had everything, and one day we had nothing. Right? Like there's a lot of things that you don't consider as a child, but it's still the obviousness and innocence of a child that I think is really important to help us and guide us, because it is still not in anyone's best interest, to go forth in war. So I think that was the earlier stages, and I just think it's more reminiscent now, because there's always war. I have kids now, they're saying the same things that I used to see. So it's something that's come up a couple times in our household and such, but difficult ones. I hope one day that we can kind of get past that. I still say though, I used to think if aliens were to attack Earth, that there would be a great unification, but then there's to be also the others that want to unite with the aliens. So I'm not sure if you've heard that before, but yeah,
I haven't heard it, but I can see
you know what I
what might
mean?
happen.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah,
kind
I
of
think it.
interesting.
That's an interesting one. So I think this is a very tricky topic, because wars is one thing which I also never thought of. How can young people influence it? Because if your friend is asking that, and if your kids are asking that, it's a situation of, is it a situation of utter helplessness, or do you think that in this day and age young people can actually make a difference to that topic?
Well, I think they can make a difference now. Like I think it's a little bit different than when I was younger, because the internet was starting out. If you look at what social media can do, and how fast information can travel, I think you can make a difference, but you have to be targeted and pointed, because it can't just be noise, because that's always the difficulty around. If you just become noisy and you don't touch the right topics, then it's just noise, right? You have to be able to touch the right topics to have the impact, right? um, and sometimes it's short-lived. Sometimes these sensations come up and they're quick and they're gone by the next day. But I think some of them can be lasting, and those ones that have big names and things like that, I think that they can make a difference, right? We really, how would you have done that? You would have lobbied as a child, in front of government, in different speaking forums and such, trying to travel the world, which was not very feasible. And now you can do those things. You can do those things through YouTube. You can do those things through podcasts. You can do those things through social media. Yeah, not that I'm advocating for young people to be accessing social media, because I think that's another really scary topic in itself.
And tell me about it.
Yeah.
With two teenagers and one who certainly was growing up just as social media took off. So she's the first generation of young people who experienced it, and has become quite anti social media as a consequence as she's matured. It's very interesting to see that it's a tool that can be used for a lot of good. And the same thing holds true for AI. Right now, in an age of AI, um, I'm digressing a little bit from your own early experiences, but what I think is that it can be used so powerfully, but there is this challenge that I see with this new technology, that it can also be used to create very easily and very quickly deep fakes,
Yeah, for sure. But at the same
right?
time, there's technology around to try to fish those out, and we have hardware vendors that can easily lace the data with identifiers to showcase when those types of things happen. We have control of the hardware. We can do those types of things, but it's usually problematic, especially we're coming up to these electoral times. We're going into a lot of new governments around the world, and this is one of the first times where we've really truly have had plausible speech that can be brought up very, very quickly, that can potentially suppress good news or suppress bad news, with the opposite, depending on what they're trying to do. But yeah, it's an interesting time. The deep fake aspect is problematic, um, and I think it's problematic in many forms, not just the electoral forms, but like the social aspects too, and the body dysmorphia. Maybe I'm using the word incorrectly, but the unrealistic representation of people out there and such. Like the perfect skin all the time, or trimming what is conceived as unsightly for one but normal for others. Things like that. Like it just creates unrealistic expectations, and people like looking at things that they shouldn't be looking at. Like I have a young daughter who's very fit and athletic, and she's asking, is she fat? And I'm like, well, where does that come from? Like it doesn't come from, she's not on social media, but somehow she's getting exposed to it. We don't talk like that in the household, but somehow, whether it be at school or elsewhere, these things start to come up, right? Generally society, like that's not what it is normalized around, and that's a huge problem, because there's a lot of people. I get into many interesting stories about my past, but like um yeah, it's a huge problem, yeah, in society right now, I think.
Is there any other interesting story from the past in context of our conversation that you want to share?
Well, I don't think so, like not in that context. I just think that like we're learning, right? So one thing that I think we can bring in is like what we accept today will not be what we accept tomorrow. We'll realize that we were wrong, and then we'll, a few weeks later, or months later, years later, realize what we previously thought was wrong, and then what we actually thought before was right. And then we'll quickly realize several months later that we were wrong again. These things it's interesting how it comes. I'm not sure if you've seen some of the kind of people jumping into the future. Have you ever seen these interesting duels where it's like they're talking to themselves, and it's like, okay, so I want to let you know that eggs are really bad. We found out, it's 2030 right now. Eggs are the worst thing. And then they come back and it's like, okay, your future comes back and it's 2035. We found out we were completely wrong. eggs are actually really healthy. It's just the consumption of eggs at certain times of the day is problematic. And then they come back in 5 years. And it's like, so we have to be more censored. But I'm not talking about like government censoring. We want to have freedom of speech. But at the same time, when you're impacting others, we have to be more grounded and considerate of what we're sharing, right? So
So I think in one way, if I think bring it back to young people, there are a number of things you're actually talking about. It comes down to education, right? It is educating these young people to be critical thinkers on the one hand, so they can actually look at information and actually at least be able to process it and say, I'm not sure if it's right or wrong or whatever. Let me actually go deeper into it. Then there is judgment around what to put out there and what not to put out there, and how to be a little bit more responsible. And the third thing is actually just being adept at understanding the how technology is evolving and being able to use it rather than being left behind. So there are all
but you
these things.
yeah, but you bring up these topics around children. I think children are really an important area that should be studied, but adults and such struggle with this critical thinking, awareness of technology and how things can be used just as like, right? So I think it's something that we need to make sure that we understand. It's not just a child issue. I think many people struggle in this area, and the technology doesn't help us either. Our own biases are reaffirmed, through our searches, through our histories, things like that. So like it's difficult. And I think the critical thinking aspect, I think we can teach people some tools around that, but ultimately there's many people who still struggle in their lives with critical thinking, like
I
to the
agree,
point of like
Stephen.
very educated people, because we have our biases that we want to affirm. So this is a really interesting one. We talk about the basics, mathematical basics, right? Like some people with PhDs, some people with, undergraduate degrees from great universities, and you talk to them, very simple subject. They have a mortgage on their house. Let's say it's a $2 million house, and they have a 2 million, let's say it's just $1 million mortgage. And they say, oh, well, I have a 4% interest rate, right? It's like, well, you're paying 40 grand a year in taxes or on interest. No. I don't pay that much. No, you do. No. They worked it out for me.
I think it's habits. Yeah, exactly. But building on that point, Stephen, the reason I actually was talking about young people is research has suggested, including from NASA, that the earlier we build skills in people, the better it is, right? Therefore, I mean, in my 25 years, I've seen, for example, in management consulting, that changing mindsets is the hardest thing to do in a digital transformation, for example, right? Because changing adults is so difficult. So therefore, you've got to go and start doing things much earlier in a much more complicated world. Let's talk about, what you're doing today. I mean, there are a number of very important points. Do you believe that as a senior professional, that education system is actually preparing these people with the kinds of traits that we're talking about?
I haven't seen one myself. I don't think it's preparing them for that. But like we're also attempting to prepare people for something that, for an age that we don't know. There's going to be a lot of transformation that happens, in that period. But the stuff from early childhood, that stuff's pretty ingrained, right? It doesn't really go away. Right. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to provide tooling around that. So I do think that
Yeah,
there's an
exactly.
opportunity there to explore that's not explored in the current system. But then just as much to go along with that, the current education system has a very kind of set histogram of buckets in a very narrow form, where it's like, if you don't fit these three, then you're an outlier, and we got to fix you to fit you into those three. And it's like, that's hugely problematic because it's much more diverse than that. They just don't know how to handle it, and nor do they actually need to handle it. And there's such like an intervention type mentality where they try to, because they think they see something wrong, like, and it's just, we talk to a lot of parents, and yeah, it causes a lot of worry in parents, trying to bucket kids and things like that.
This episode is brought to you by Lumi.network. We're on a mission to help the next generation prepare to take on the world. our AI augmented platform runs quests that help 10 to 25-year-olds shape their future by developing AI, entrepreneurship, and design thinking skills to solve the most pressing business and social issues. If you or your organization wants to impact the next generation positively, we'd love to talk to you. To learn more, visit lumi.network.
So now on the one hand, we're talking about there's a huge opportunity, I think, to refresh education that contrasts with the difficulty of changing curriculums across the world. I mean, I see this firsthand. But at the same time, AI steps in. Now it's causing, kind of wild tremors in the whole education establishment, right from universities to schools. Um, so you talk a lot about AI policy, right? That's one of your big areas of focus. How does that work for young people? How do we bring in that kind of governance in education?
Well, I think it's more about, if you look at the EU AI Act and we look at, the buckets and classifications of higher risk, when you're dealing with people, just as we've done, in financial sector, medicine, health, etc., we just had to be extra careful. The audits, the validation of what we're doing, and what we're doing on the surface might look great, but behind the scenes, the implications of it in the longer term, we have to consider. And if you don't have experienced people doing these types of studies, then we're going to be in that problem state where it's like we rush too quickly and now we're dealing with the implications of that. And that's what I see more often than not. Business, etc., is pushing as hard as they can. Everybody wants to adopt AI. A lot of people don't understand the implications of doing so. um, some companies say, well, we don't have a consumer focus, it's just internal. And it's like, well, is it okay that you're to your shareholders that you're showcasing the wrong information to your CFO, to your CEO, because your model is stagnant, or it has a lot of drift and the data's changed? Like, so there is rationale to do things properly. There's just very few groups that really understand how to do it properly or what it means to create sustainable AI. Data scientists and people that work in AI were able to showcase kind of what we want to showcase, but that's hugely problematic, right? Because usually you have a boss and you're trying to show that boss what the boss wants, so that's a good result in an area. Even though if, like, and you put them in, they're not bad people, they're just trying to show what they think is needed. We had to build tooling to automatically notify people if they have drift or they have bias or they're using certain types of data sets that could potentially be problematic in the future, right? If you don't collect the data around building the model, and then that data scientist or AI specialist doesn't come into work, I can't reproduce that model. There's no way in the world. I am not in his head. I don't know how it was developed. Can't reproduce. But if we collect it, then we can govern it. We can understand it. We can proactively react before things are happening, right? So, like, all of this goes into this continuous governance of AI and continuous compliance with AI, where we have the right data, we can understand what's going on, we can move as the times change, whether that be an internal problem or a regulatory problem, an industry problem, all those types of things.
Hmm.
So
So,
from that, it builds upon like that ethical debt aspect that I've been talking a lot about. Do it now or do it later.
yeah, well, so ethical debt. Tell me a little bit about that. What does that mean?
Well, what we see often is we build use cases, or groups build use cases. They're really eager. They want to get it out. They don't want to collect the metadata. They don't want to do the right user studies. The typical, there's like this latency issue where they want to push ahead of it. Then, let's say we spend $100 million to train a model, power, GPUs, accelerators, etc. Then a regulation is proposed or a piece of data is required to be removed, and then that's null and void. So you spend all of this time to try to get it out there, but ultimately, because you didn't preserve certain checkpoints or certain pieces of what you've built, then you can't use it in the future, right? So there's a lot of different reasons why you'll want to make sure that you're collecting information around the use cases, around the data, around the licenses, around the data, all of these things, and checkpoints around when you include different parts of the data, so that in the event that you need to remove data, you can do it in an elegant way versus a very laborious way. That if you don't preserve the metadata around how you built the models, who worked on them, the justification, the rationale, all that type of stuff, then when you try to use it, you can choose to throw it over the fence, and then your legal officer is like, well, we'll deal with it if it happens. But really, you could have done it better. You could have collected all that information, and then you could have made a real decision at the time to say, is there risk with it, right? So that ethical debt side is like, you can either do it earlier on with automation and tooling, or you can do it at the end. But you need to do these things, because if we have big black swan events or something like that, that's going to impede the entire industry.
In a simple, in simple terms for our listeners, ethical debt is, how would you define it? Like using and storing data properly so that uh, when in future your use cases change, that
Yeah, I
and you
think,
have to.
yeah, no, and I think that's kind of the right pretense, but think of the metadata around everything that you're doing, the type of
Okay.
algorithms that was used, the bias, protected attributes, things that like, race and color and all these types of things that might naturally just feed in, but you need to make sure that you store a reference to how it was used. The library that was used at a time. Maybe it's a security vulnerability, but you need
All
to make
right. Okay.
sure that it's referenceable so that you have all of that audit trail, the transparency that's required. So at the end of the day, you can fix things if they are bad, in a
Okay.
sense, bad being a wide spectrum of what bad means,
No, no, I
right?
now understand.
Right.
That is a great point. See, that neatly moves on to the point that we were discussing briefly before we started, which is, you know, I'm doing this sitting out of Dubai, as opposed to being in London, where I've been for, over 2 decades. And what I'm hearing in the Middle East is, can we trust, AI because it's largely trained on Western data? So, how do you deal with this question in your world? And what's
Well,
your answer to those people, or what should I say when they ask me this question?
Well, I think it's great that they're talking about it, because it should be talked about, and not enough people talk about it. Most of the data, don't quote me on percentages. I would, if I had to pull it from the air, I'd say 80% of the data is based on Western views. You know, it's just, that's how it feels. I can be completely wrong, right? But that creates a number of, difficulties in that area, but it doesn't have to, right? You can benefit from that large cohort of data and knowledge in a sense. Um, and there's ways that we know to protect the output, but very few companies invest in that because it's very expensive. So the way that we protect the output semantically is that, like, we look at different types of forms to guide the answers. So if we have a knowledge graph that's well curated, really hard to create, not cheap to create properly, but we have a knowledge graph of the acceptable answers in the domain that we want to represent, that we're providing a service for, we can make sure that it is validated through, that knowledge graph, to make sure that the information coming out is okay. So if they validate the information coming out that is within the realm of acceptability in their use case, then you're pretty safe in that avenue, right? It doesn't mean that there can't be outliers, or problems with the language and things like that, that sometimes slip through, but like generally it fixes like 99% of the problems, right? You don't have to be worried about it, right?
Okay, understood. Understood. So let's go to IBM more broadly, and what you're doing there. So what are institutions like IBM, not just IBM, doing uh, to uplift the skill level and or the education level,
Yeah.
um, or anything in AI related to young people? Is that a
Mhm.
topic that you see come up in your engagements or discussions at all?
Well, I think there's a couple areas that has come up in terms of diversity. I think that's a really important one, that I think it's generally, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, I'm speaking on behalf of myself right now too, but I think or I like to think maybe it's my own biases that I'm reflecting upon, but I think we are understanding more as a society. It's not about inclusion of diversities right now. I hope we're realizing that. It's not just about getting that minority into the workplace. If they're not educated in the right way, they're not going to be
Exactly.
impactful. They're going to be looked down upon, etc. Right? Because they're not at the level that the rest of the group is at. Right? We need to start earlier on primary school, etc., to make sure that all of those groups are exposed, like, to the diversity of what's available, right? That we don't pigeonhole people in because they're female or because, they grew up in this group or whatever, right? Give them that opportunity, right? So, but that's an incredibly challenging task, though, right? To give them those opportunities, yeah, across the board, right? Because different schools will have different amounts of qualified teachers in certain areas in terms of resources available to them. But I do think that companies are becoming more and more aware of that. So investing more in the schools, doing more outreach programs in schools and things like that to try to bring them up. Um, but if we go back a little bit to what I was talking about, and I helped with some papers at the World Economic Forum around the shift left mentality, is like building in automation and tooling earlier on in the pipelines. I think all of that helps to provide guidance, because the number of one-on-one conversations I can have is just limited. But if I make a tool that creates the guidance to say, hey, are you ever going to use this in production or ever going to use this in a product? And then someone answers that and it guides them, then that goes 1,000-fold versus a conversation that needs to be had, right? So we add these pieces of tooling in along the way to help guide people. It will be a lot more natural. But that's a little bit for current workplace, and a little bit for things that we can do in the schools. But yeah, it's a very challenging topic.
Yeah, it's a challenging topic. Absolutely, I think so. Given that we have limited time, Stephen, let's take a leap into the future.
Mhm.
There's so much happening on AI. What do you see the world to be like by 2040? There's doom and gloom on one hand, and there's a lot of optimism on the other hand. And yeah, I'd love to hear your views.
Well, I think the access to information is going to continue to exponentially grow. The way that we're able to retrieve information very, very quickly, I think we've never seen anything like it. I think that will continue for the foreseeable future. But that also creates a number of challenges for us. The ability to retain information, kind of shifts our mental capacity is focused in different areas versus that retaining ability that we're able to, just pull it up from Google or whatever search that we want. Um, I do think that we're going to see a lot change in medicine. I think that we have the possibility to test different drug designs in a much more feasible, scalable way and do it much quicker in areas in dimensions that we never really thought of as humans. Computers are much better at that. Um, so I think we're going to see a revolution in medicine. I think that we're going to see medicines for you and for me and my gene structure and others, DNA and such. So I think that's going to be a huge one. Computers are going to help us there. What else? Will we ever get autonomous driving from Tesla? I think it'll eventually come. In a sense of it,
I know. I
this
think
is a little bit of a joke, but I think, like, for myself, I'm definitely worried about the casualties. I think we need to think of a different way beyond the acceptance of problems in these spaces, because those are real people. These are real outcomes, and doesn't matter that it's big business. Yeah, like, I'm sorry, somebody might say $1 billion is worth more than a person. Yeah, I don't think that. Like, I concretely do not think that. Every person, what if that next person, what if that person was the next Albert Einstein and their proofs, lasted, a millennium? Like, I just don't think we can put a value on people's lives, and such. So
that is
I'm
quite
pretty worried
profound. Yeah,
about the
that's
casualties.
true. Yeah, I think it's a great point. Um, and and as someone at the forefront of um, AI governance, and what would your advice be to someone, a young person who's in high school or even in university, on how to prepare for what's ahead?
I
Very
think a
simple
lot of
things.
people,
What?
yeah, I think a lot of people would probably, like, not agree with what I'm gonna say, but I'm gonna say it because it's my views, right? I think there's a lack of all the people that I've interviewed and all the people that I've interacted with. There's a diversity in terms of their understanding about how mathematics works and like, or how techniques works or how APIs work. A lot of people are like, it's becoming so easy that people just use it without understanding what they're doing, right? Going back to the basics, understanding the foundations, the linear algebra that goes into it. Like, I think getting back to those basics, making sure that you have a strong foundation in mathematics and truly understanding it. There's one thing to do it on a piece of paper and move on, but what are the implications in the real world when you translate it? So I think that that
Why
foundation
would
is really important.
and why would people disagree with you?
Well, I think like some people are like, oh, that's not the modern age. There's APIs that you use and you don't have to
Oh,
understand
okay.
it and things like that, which is really true. You can do a lot of amazing things really, really quickly, but what is the longevity of those solutions in practice? Like, you might do a lot.
Yeah.
So let's say you create 20 great things that your manager gives you the stamp of approval, and you feel a little bit better about yourself. But then ultimately in 2 years, all 20 of those things have failed at the end. Like, so what was the success there? Right? Because you didn't prepare it properly. Right. So like, I think that it's a different age right now. Like right now, like I remember this is an interesting one. It actually goes back to my son, and they're talking about, he's in grade 5 right now, and everything he's like off the charts except for writing, right? And they're like, oh, don't worry about that, just use text to speech, you'll be perfectly fine. And I'm like, mm, I don't know about that. I think we need to know how to write still, send an email. But people are to the point of like, oh no, you'll just kind of create a summarization and send that email off to somebody. And it's like, well, I think we're going to lose a lot if we start doing things like that all the time, like as a
What an
society,
interesting point. Yeah. What an
right? Like
interesting point.
like
I think
our
being
original thinking, like, you're not even really like, imagine you and I corresponding like that. It'd feel like so pre-canned and like too rosy. Like it's not natural. Like the diversity in the conversation is what's interesting, right? That's what makes you unique and me unique. But if these things are all
mm,
scrubbed through and produce content, it's like, I think it'd be a pretty sad state. What if we gave up on artists and such and just used all these generators to create art? They'd be heavily biased on all the previous works that ever been. Where's the originality that comes out of it? Well, yeah, I think it's a simple reference to something that I see and that's becoming accepted. But I think that I don't know if we should really rely on that. I don't think we have enough information. I think we need to fast
yeah,
forward
we
a
should
little
not.
bit, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Stephen, it's been great talking to you.
Thanks for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a story or someone you know does, please recommend them to us by email at hello@lumi.network. We'll see you next time on In Youth We Trust.